Hello, everyone. I'm Lynn O'Donnell. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be an important and illuminating discussion on the economics of faith. Why are Islamic leaders silent on Uyghur suffering? Uyghurs, of course, are the Turkic Islamic people of China's northwestern region of Xinjiang. They've been incarcerated in enormous numbers. Up to 2 million Uyghur people are said to have been detained in prison camps, tortured and brainwashed in what the Chinese authorities say is an effort to eradicate terrorism. Others, however, call it a genocide. Pointedly, though, there's been very little said about this practice by Muslim leaders anywhere, and that's what we're here to discuss. Let me introduce our guest speakers. Rahima Mahmoud. Welcome, Rahima. Rahima is a Uyghur human rights activist, interpreter and translator, and a singer. She's the UK director for the World Uyghur Congress, executive director for Stop Uyghur Genocide, and an advisor to the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. As an interpreter, she's worked on many breaking news stories relating to the Uyghur genocide, and as an activist, she's become a prominent voice for Uyghurs in the UK. Dr. Maria Bastos, she did her PhD in politics at Westminster University. She specialised in South Asia foreign policy with a focus on Pakistan. Her research interests include post-colonial and feminist approaches to the study of foreign policy and militarism in South Asia and the Euro-Pacific region. And Dr. Azim Ibrahim. He's a director of special initiatives at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, D.C. He's also an adjunct research professor at the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. He holds a PhD from Cambridge and was an International Security Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and a World Fellow at Yale. His books include The Rohingyas Inside Myanmar's Genocide and Radical Origins, Why We Are Losing the War Against Islamic Extremism. And he's also, like me, a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine. Now, before I call on our speakers, I'd like to present a short film made by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. It features an interview with a Uyghur woman, Zumrat Dawood, about her experience inside a Chinese prison camp in Xinjiang.
Vatandagi vaqtida saqchi mashinasining ovozini anglasaqmi, butun Uyg'ur putqo'limizda jon qolmaydi. 2017-yilning 5-dan boshlab Ürümçide qalaymagan tutuş yüz berdi. Yani ularningki aytishicha bu tarbiyalash markazi deb chiroyli nomlarla atadi. Lekin bu tarbiyalash markazi emas, bu haqiqatan turma. Andikin dedi, bunun içinde sen çetelikler bilen aloqalashibsa, ularga urgan kirgan nomerlar bor ekan. Men kelganda endi meniki gunoyim bo'lsa endi men chet elga chiqqan boshqa davlatlarga. Ikkinchi Amerika vizasi oldim bo'ldi. Uchinchi chet elliklarga telefon qilganmi bir gunoy hisoblaydi ekan ular hozirgi vaziyatda. Men chet elliklarga pul oldi satdi. Shu ularning nazarida endi men bu gunohlarning hammasini men qilgan. Telefonlarda mesela en addisi Türkiye'nin bayrağı yoki Allah yoki biraz sürelerini tordan düşergen yoki Facebook, WhatsApp deganlarni ishlatganlarni aşağı içinde hemmasi shu sababdan kirganlar. Atdigani qo'pqandan keyin davlat she'ri aytildi. Davlat she'ri aytilgandan keyin anandan keyin Xi Jinpingga rahmat. Yoshson Xi Jinping degandek gaplarni qilgandan keyin endi men anadan keyin tomoq berildi. Anadan keyin bizga nurg'un narsalarga qo'l qo'ydirib, ichidagi masalan o'g'inish deb ataydi bular. Shunda chiroyli qilib mening yuz bergan va'dam hech qanday odamga ichidagi ishlarni demayman. Көйге аңлығынымны, білгінімні, ұққынымны, сақчамның ismini, qanda saqchi barligini degandek ashunda nurg'un narsalarga men imzo qo'ydim. Bu mening qo'royimniki darvozasi. Buningga cho'qim yuzimizni skanerlab, yuzimizni tungandan keyin eshik ochildi. Chiqiblam yo'ldoshim u yerda turmaslikni o'yladi. Chunki u yerda hech qanday bir erkinchilik yo'q. Sirtda yashadik degan bilanmi hech qanday erkinlik yo'q. 24 soat bizni kuzatib turdi. Men emas har qanday nurg'un ishlar bor. Masalan, angadisi 2 kun mashina haydamasak musaqchixonaga chaqirtilamiz. Mashinamizga mayni jiqiraq qachilib vassakmi mashinaga nima uchun jiqmay qachilding deb chaqirtilamiz. Hattoki mashina haydamasakmi, mashina nima uchun haydamading degandek ishlar bilan saqchixonaga chaqirtilib turamiz. Men hozir erkin dunyoda. Men emas, mening qarindoshlarim, ota-onamga o'xshash, ini-sing'illarimga o'xshashlar begunoh yetyapti. Ularning ovozi yo'q. Ular so'zlayolmaydi. Xalqaraga yetkazolmaydi. Menga endi fursat bor. Men ularning ovozi bo'lishni tanladim.
A sobering interview with Zumrat Dawit on her experiences in a Chinese labor camp. Sobering. Our first guest is Rahima Mahmood, who will speak on the power of profit, why Uyghurs are missing their natural Islamic allies.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone who is watching. And assalamu alaikum. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm so pleased to be here alongside my fellow panelists whose work on this issue has been crucial to the global understanding of the persecution of Uyghurs in East Turkestan and beyond. Over the past 5.5 years, the world has been turned upside down for the Uyghur community, and many of us are still in shock. We have witnessed our homeland turned into a police state. Women being forcibly sterilized, children separated from their parents. Around 3 million of my fellow Uyghurs have now been detained in concentration camps, where they face the worst of humanity, including torture, systematic rape, and even organ harvesting. As a community, we have collectively suffered a great trauma, but each Uyghur has their own story. I have myself unable to contact my family since January 2017. I still do not know if they are safe or detained in concentration camps. This struggle has so often been a lonely one. For years, it felt that no one could hear us. No one would listen to our pleas for help. Although more people are waking up to atrocities being committed against my people, we still feel the painful absence of some allies that we expected to come to our aid in our darkest hours, particularly those with whom we share our faith and our Turkic roots. But what I want to convey to you today is that this is deliberate. The lack of support from Islamic countries is by the Chinese regime's design. There has always been a paranoia deep at the heart of the Chinese Communist Party about the independence of East Turkestan, since the area was occupied by the CCP in 1949. Ever since, the Chinese regime has leveraged its economic dominance to isolate the Uyghurs and to leave them defenseless. Anywhere the regime has seen an opportunity to loan money to a struggling country, they have done. Chinese investment in Muslim nations, many through its infamous Belt and Road Initiative, have led to a deafening silence from many leading figures in the Islamic world, like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, for which billions of dollars in investment have been traded for Pakistan's silence and complicity. Or Turkey, who received a $1 billion bailout from China's central bank. But the Chinese government have been attempting to spread their influence for far longer than the past 5 years. They have long felt vulnerable surrounded by Muslim nations, whilst they persecuted the Muslim that lived on their soil. The vulnerability and the paranoia led to the formation of the Shanghai Five in 1996, a security agreement to form between China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. The Shanghai Five grew into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which counts Uzbekistan, India, and Pakistan as members. Members of this organization have agreed to exchange wanted people. For the Uyghurs, this has been devastating. For the individuals that have suffered deportation under the agreement, and for the wider community who are not safe in the countries that feel most like home to them. Now, our natural lands of Central Asia are a very dangerous place for Uyghur people. After a massacre in my hometown in 1997, known as the Gulja Massacre, the Chinese regime sent plainclothes police detectives to Central Asian countries, especially Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, to capture Uyghurs that had fled there in fear. Struggling countries like Tajikistan are in desperate need of money, and the Chinese government has used that as an opportunity to silence the Uyghur people's historic allies. In 2019, Zinetgul Tursun and her two toddlers, daughters were deported from Turkey to Tajikistan. Once they touched down in Tajikistan, they were detained and taken back to the Uyghur region. It was later discovered that Zinetgul's daughters were delivered back to her mother, but that Zinetgul herself disappeared. But it is not just our Central Asian neighbors that have turned their backs on the Uyghurs. Turkey has been a home to my people for a long time. We share so much of our culture with them. In 2009, after Urumqi massacre, Erdogan declared the Chinese regime's treatment of Uyghurs a genocide. It was a moment of recognition for the Uyghurs, who had been suffering under violent crackdown after violent crackdown since 1949. But within 1 month, Erdogan was forced to apologize. Now the situation for Uyghurs living in Turkey has drastically deteriorated, and many of them are trying to go to safe countries. This means that yet another heaven for the Uyghurs has been cruelly ripped away from us by China's long arm. The list of unsafe nations is growing, and it feels as though the walls are closing in on our community. Thailand is detaining Uyghurs. There are reports of black sites in Dubai, and Egypt has deported students who later died in CCP's concentration camps. Now Uyghurs trapped under Taliban rule in Afghanistan must once again live in constant fear. Any potential ally to the Uyghurs, whether it is through faith, history, or culture, is identified by the Chinese government, and then their silence is bought. But I find hope in the support we have found in the faith communities here in the UK, a cross-section of communities fighting for our rights, from the Jewish community to the Christians and the Muslims. As an activist, I constantly meet young Muslims who are outraged by what is happening to their Uyghur brothers and sisters in East Pakistan. I have hope that those grassroots will continue to grow until Islamic leaders can no longer ignore the calls for justice from those they represent. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahima. A very passionate plea for people to listen. Maria, I'm going to turn to you now. You're going to speak on the Uyghur issue as an inconvenient truth for Pakistan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the Open Forum for the opportunity to speak on this important event. And thank you to Rahima Mahmood for highlighting once again the plight of the Uyghur people, which definitely constitutes one of the, if not forgotten issues in international politics, one of the one that has not been paid enough attention, or just from time to time when perhaps conveniently suits. In the case of Pakistan, the Uyghur issue is absolutely one that causes the call for talking about hypocrisy and what I called the politics of forced amnesia. Pakistan relation with China is one of the most highlighted in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, in the form of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which traverses Pakistan as an economic corridor and ends or starts in Xinjiang. And this economic corridor has definitely shaped the relation of Pakistan with China in the past 5 to 10 years. So the billions that Rahima spoke about are absolutely true in terms of how this relationship is shaped, and the interlink that exists between identity and economy between China and Pakistan. Both countries, Pakistan and China, do act in terms of paranoia and paranoia with security. So it comes at no surprise that Pakistan avoids to talk about the Muslim Uyghur genocide. In that shape, we have had several statements from Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, where first he said he doesn't know what is happening, and soon, sometime after, he adds to say that we speak with China in private. This obviously it is a disservice to the Uyghur Muslims, and obviously it's makes him completely complicit with genocide that is currently happening. Moreover, Pakistan community in terms of foreign policy and think tanks are very committed to portray China-Pakistan relations solely in terms of geostrategic and geoeconomic aspects, and totally leave behind and do their best so that the Uyghur genocide is not even mentioned. I could experience that myself whilst I stayed in Pakistan, and it can be documented. For instance, for the China-Pakistan Institute in Islamabad, who does a work of using soft power to cover the atrocities that currently go on. For instance, they use Xinjiang as a touristic attraction where Pakistan could potentially go for tourism, and obviously would ignore all the detention camps that exist. So there is a great commitment from certain strategic and foreign policy fields in Pakistan to not to hide this issue from international community. On the other hand, scholars have also pointed that there is an existing similarity between what India does in China and India does in Kashmir and what China does in Xinjiang in terms of an open detention camp. However, Pakistan uses and tries to campaign for Kashmir rights, whereas at the same time ignores the Xinjiang genocide. This obviously brings a great inconsistency in terms of discourses of human rights that Pakistan difficultly could have any position that would be recommendable to attain. On the other hand, Pakistan as a post-colonial state continues to be part of a colonial project, which, in view of its relation with China, because what China does in Xinjiang, or how China acts in Xinjiang, is exactly a colonial project with all the characteristics of colonialism. So Pakistan, in one hand, is able to criticize former colonial powers, America and European colonial powers, but on the other hand, it totally relies on China and supports this horrendous situation that happens in Xinjiang. Of course, this is totally inconsistent with Pakistan's position and will to become, or to be the leader of the Muslim world, which is something Pakistan has aspired basically since its foundation in 1947. However, Pakistan cannot for much long hopefully sustain this position of choose picking with whom they want to defend and which human rights they want to defend. So hence, whilst advocating for Kashmir and pushing the Kashmir agenda question forward in every forum they might find suitable, they continue to ignore Uyghur genocide at the expense, obviously, of human rights, and just totally focused on their economic and security priorities. In a way, it is how the international system has been founded and how the international system works. And for Pakistan at the moment, that it is exactly what is required from them. But this obviously needs to be highlighted, and Pakistan perhaps should be pressurized to do more for Uyghur rights and to highlight Uyghur genocide. However, that probably could be very difficult to happen due to the strong relationship with China, which Pakistan very unlikely would drop or do anything that would go against China's interests in the region. Therefore, Pakistan definitely, although it is acknowledged that does exist a Chinese issue with Uyghurs, Pakistan will continue, in my view, will continue to deny or to play a blind eye into what's currently happening in Xinjiang.
Thank you, Maria. A very comprehensive analysis of Pakistan's complicity of silence with China over the Uyghur issue. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Azim Ibrahim. You're going to tell us, Azim, why we should care about the Uyghur genocide.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you so much to the Open Forum for organising this, and thanks so much, Maria, for your very careful analysis on China, Pakistan, and Rahima for your very sobering words of what's happening around the globe to the Uyghurs. In July 2019, 22 countries signed a letter condemning China for its behaviour against the Uyghurs. Literally a day after, we had over 37 countries sign a counter letter praising China for its treatment of the Uyghurs. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the 22 countries that condemned China were all Western countries. They were all non-Muslim countries, and they're all democratic countries. And the 37 countries that supported China were all Muslim countries. The entirety of the Muslim world stood behind China. Now, Maria has gave us a very careful analysis as to why a country like Pakistan is in the China camp. But there are much more significant global implications of what is happening to the Uyghurs and the trends, global trends that we'll see if this continues. The issue of the genocide of the Uyghurs is of global significance in at least two ways. First of all, if China continues its policies and successfully destroys the Uyghur identity, which is clearly what it is trying to do, and the response from the international community is muted or non-existent, we will find ourselves in about 50 years' time in a world in which a preeminent global superpower is an unapologetic perpetrator of genocide. And this will have consequences for marginalized groups of people throughout not just China, but in its immediate neighborhood, but also anywhere in China's sphere of influence. There will never be any justice for people like the Rohingya in Myanmar, as Myanmar is quite firmly in Beijing's sphere of influence. And moreover, as China's influence continues to spread in Western Asia and in Africa, already present ethnic tensions and rivalries in these regions will be given permission to grow into full-blown ethnic warfare and even more genocides. And let us not contemplate what an increased influence of China will mean in the Balkans and give the nationalists power and permission to do whatever that they want. The alternative view is that the international community responds robustly to the Uyghur genocide. This may be the moment when China is forced to re-examine its behaviour. And China does respond to pressure, as we have seen. 20 years ago, when we first grappled with the rise of China in this century, we all hoped that would become a part of and integrated into the international community, into the global economy. Beijing would also pick up some of the values of liberal political institutions of the West. And had that happened, we would have had a chance to live in a more harmonious 21st century. Unfortunately, that has not been the trajectory of Xi Jinping in particular. Xi Jinping has come to power and sees himself as a leader for life. And his key priority seems to be to create a single-hand nationalist identity that is loyal only to the Communist Party in China. We must remember that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party is not just at war with the Uyghurs, they're at war with every ethnicity. They are at war with every religious identity, even the Christian identity, which they have been targeting for decades. They have demolished over 100 churches in China. They are even demolishing Buddhist temples. And the key purpose of this is to ensure that there is never a rival identity against the Communist Party in China. The Communist Party can be the only show in town. So the implications of this are very significant if the international community does not take action. We will see a world in which one of the largest economies, if not the largest economy, because we have to remember China is expected to overtake the United States, within just a matter of decades, but the largest economy that then sets the rules and the standards for global economics, for global trade and relations, is a unapologetic perpetrator of genocide. So the implications of this are very significant for the free world. We always anticipated that as China opens up, we will export our values to China. It will become more free, it will become more open. But in fact, the exact opposite has happened. China is exporting its values to the international community. Countries that are relying on China have to be fully on board with the Beijing project. There is no room to be neutral. There is no room to sit on the fence. You have to be fully supportive of Beijing in everything that is done. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially economic colonization, it is debt book diplomacy, giving loans to countries that they simply cannot afford, that in many cases they do not need, is a mechanism by which China will be weaponizing some of these relationships in the very near future. The Kiel Institute of Global Economics in Germany, for example, has examined 100 contracts with the Belt and Road Initiative between states, which clearly stipulate that countries are unable to make any major foreign policy decisions unless China cancels the loans and recalls the debt to be paid. So essentially, each of these states is becoming a client state. It's becoming a vassal state of Beijing. And on this current trajectory, we are seeing whole swaths of the globe that are now succumbing to Chinese and Beijing influence. So the future is very uncertain and is very concerning unless the international community starts to take action and starts to put a stop to this treatment, first of all, of the Uyghurs, but also every other minority that is being persecuted in communist China. Thank you.
Thank you. We saw first the Tibetans, they tried hard, now it's the Uyghurs. Now it's time for some questions, and I'm going to ask the first one, perhaps to you, Aleem. Given that the Chinese government does, as you said, regard itself as the world's preeminent political and economic power, and soon to become probably the richest country in the world, certainly with superpower status, is us caring about the Uyghurs going to make any difference? I mean, I, for instance, don't buy anything made in China if I can possibly avoid it, but it's not easy, especially with phones, laptops, etc. Is the world going to acquiesce and make its feelings known about these issues by just stopping purchasing made in China?
Well, Lynn, this is a very good question, and it's not an easy question either, because simply we in the West, and in fact globally, have become addicted to cheap Chinese goods, and almost entirety of our supply chains and our manufacturing is located now in China. And this is actually part of Xi Jinping's policy that every country in the world must become reliant on China, and China must become reliant on no country whatsoever. And during the COVID crisis, we've seen very clearly this in action, in terms of the PPE and the medical apparatus that we needed. The supply chains from China were absolutely critical in catering for that. And to try to unhinge ourselves from these supply chains is not going to be an easy ask, because we have huge financial institutions in the West that are essentially heavily invested in China. And China's calculation is that when it comes to the West, after the 2008 financial crisis, they believe that the West is done, the West is finished, their time is up. And when it comes to choosing between their values and money, they will always choose money. And this is the way that Wall Street and many other investment institutions have behaved, is that they'll put money ahead, they'll put profit ahead of their values. And this is not necessarily something that they're doing wrong, because this is essentially the capitalist society. As long as you're not doing anything illegal, then there is no fault in you pursuing profit above anything else. And this is why I believe the US Congress, the parliaments in the UK and Europe have to take a much more robust stance in trying to make some of these supply chains that are relying on slave labor in the Uyghur and Xinjiang and from the cotton trade and the fashion trade, and trying to essentially outlaw those supply chains and make them much more accountable. Because unless that's done, then they'll always put profit above values.
Indeed. Thanks, Aleem. We have a question from a viewer on video we'll go to now.
Hi, my question is, could Pakistan's double game and over-edging support to China not backfire on them one day?
Maria, would you like to answer that question? Is Pakistan's support for China going to backfire, basically come back and bite it in the future?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It is indeed a pertinent question because, let's see, from my experience, that is a hidden fear that some Pakistani analysts and scholars do have. Like China, Pakistan is also a multicultural or a multi-ethnic society, and there are ethno-nationalist movements within the country, which obviously it is also a cause for paranoia and for persecution within Pakistan state. We have the case of the Pashtuns with the Pashtun movement that currently exists. However, as long as Pakistan will keep receiving money from China, and as long as the dream of CPEC will be maintained, this backfiring will be totally ignored and will not enter into geopolitical, geoeconomic calculations. But yes, I would say the potential to backfire is there.
Maria. Yes, a question for you, Azim. Why, this has come from Wilson from Dashe, why the majority of Muslim nations are not supporting the Uyghur issue? Is it just economics? Is it just economics? It's a good question. Or are there other factors at play? Azim.
Yeah. So I think the answer to this is relatively straightforward, and I think Maria's highlighting of Pakistan as a case study is very good. Essentially, Pakistan was a country that was essentially a basket case economy. Nobody wanted to touch it with a barge pole. For many decades, it was on the list of nations that sponsored terrorism. And then you had a situation in which China, a financial power, came in and invested over $62 billion in CPAC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And now when you visit Pakistan, everywhere you will see signs about CPAC, bridges, highways, roads, power stations, all built by China. And you see signs of Pakistan-China friendship is higher than the highest mountains and deeper than the deepest oceans, etc. So there's a very public display of fawning over China. Now, from Pakistan's perspective, you can see from the leaders of Pakistan, they simply didn't really have much of a choice. There was no investment forthcoming into their country, and here was China, a neighbouring power that was willing to invest in their nation and build their infrastructure. And I think we have to try to understand that this is what is most appealing about China's strategy, is that countries, if you are a leader, especially if you're an illegitimate leader of a nation, and China's coming in and saying to you that we'll build your entire infrastructure of your country at no cost to you, and we'll put in all the money, where the World Bank, the European Union, and the US have turned you down, but we'll build everything for you. And on top of that, we'll also allow you to fleece some funds off the top. We will essentially turn a blind eye. You can take a few $100 million for yourself and put them in an offshore account. This is very appealing for a leader who wants to show his people that he is actually doing something, and they can visibly see stuff being built, whether it's highways or airports or ports or anything else. And it also enriches yourself, and then it also ensures that you are then essentially a part of the China project. So this works both ways. It's a win-win-win situation from China's perspective and from an illegitimate leader's perspective. And so the question in terms of why the Muslim world has succumbed to Chinese influence in such a way, the answer to that is relatively straightforward. When you mismanage your economy through corruption and through poor economic policies, then you essentially have to look to the likes of China and other nations like it to come and bail you out. On the other hand, when the West comes, they'll talk about human rights, they'll talk about accountability, they'll talk about the viability of an economic project. China has no such qualms. They will essentially give you the money when the project is completely unviable. And a good example of this is President Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka and the Hambantota port, which was turned down by every nation, including the World Bank. And when China built it, it was a complete economic dud. And so China took over the port on a 99-year lease, and essentially becoming, part of the string of perils strategy throughout the region. And so for China, this is a win-win situation. And for the likes of Rajapaksa and others, it's also a win, because you get the ports built, you get some fleece, you're able to fleece some money from the top. And so the countering this is a real challenge for the West. And I don't believe they've come up with a viable strategy as yet.
Thanks, but it's not just the poor countries. Muslim countries aren't just poor countries. Sri Lanka is a good example, and there's a couple of African nations that you can also put into that boat. But as Christine Nix, our viewer, says, there are oil-producing Muslim countries that are very wealthy, and one would think that they would have some leverage of their own, but they're also silent. Why is that?
Yeah, one of the reasons why is essentially that China overreacts to even the slightest slight. You can see this in the behaviour. If you're part of a corporation, a media corporation, or a financial corporation, and you send out a single tweet like the coach of the Houston Rockets did, then they'll cancel just saying stand with Hong Kong, and they'll cancel contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So the reaction has to be over the top, and that is simply because they are trying to set an example, a benchmark. So countries and corporations in the West will self-censor and behave themselves. So when Canada, makes a statement, they'll kidnap two of their citizens. When Australia says we should look into the COVID origins of the COVID vaccine, they'll have full sanctions applied to China, to Australia. So the reaction of Beijing always has to be completely over the top to set an example. And so if any country even tries to use some of this leverage against Beijing, even makes the slightest statement about Hong Kong, Taiwan, Uyghurs, COVID, the reaction will be completely over the top. So other countries will see this as a lesson and will fall into line. And so there's not much appetite and courage from these countries to speak up. And the policy of China is to pick these countries off one by one. Whereas if the countries manage to coalesce together and work together, Xi Jinping will be under enormous pressure to change his attitude and to change his policies. But that is simply not forthcoming at the moment.
Indeed. And Maria, we've seen China's great interest in Afghanistan, red carpet treatment for the Taliban leadership in early August. It looks like Pakistan is going to be used as a throughput for the Belt and Road to Europe. What's your view on that? Can Europe sort of put its hand up and say, no, thank you?
Europe could, perhaps, given dubious historical Pakistan role that played in the past, specifically in Afghanistan. In fact, Europe could use the current situation in Afghanistan to pressurize Pakistan in order to be complicit in not only in the question of Uyghur, but also other rights violations that Pakistan persistently does. Now, coming to the question of the Middle East and oil, if it's true that there are plans to go ahead with the oil refinery sponsored by Saudi Arabia in Gwadar, I don't see why the Middle East countries would really speak on the Uyghur genocide. Moreover, as already mentioned, Middle East countries, they do have a tradition of not speaking in other countries' affairs in terms of rights, mainly because themselves have issues on that front, and they do not have identity issues in their lands that could justify such sort of engagement. Therefore, yes, in a way, Europe does have an opportunity to pressurize Pakistan, and on the other hand, it is very unlikely that any of the oil-producing countries in the Middle East would ever engage with pressurizing China for this matter.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Maria. Rahim, I have a question for you from Nikki, who's watching from London. She's noting that there is an increasing awareness of this issue of the Uyghur genocide. It has been called a genocide by America, for instance, by other countries. Does that rising awareness of this as an issue make any difference to you? Do you see a change? Do you see any hope for the future that China will be pressured to reverse this policy, or are we too far ahead?
Thank you. It's a great question. Well, if we compare 2 years ago to 3 years ago, yes, awareness raising has been quite successful on the issue, especially after the US and many other parliaments declared this as genocide. But the actions is still very little, very small, and therefore the grassroots movement is very important. And I am hopeful. I know no regime can last forever, even though we can see how powerful China is now, and it looks like it's almost impossible to win or to change the situation, because China is still in denial, complete denial about what is happening. And for that reason, we have to, especially the civil society, NGOs, and grassroots people must act to, in the end, as I said earlier, things can change when millions, come together and to pressurize their own governments, and also, for example, Beijing 2022 Olympic. And I don't know if you have followed the news in what happened during the last few days in Greece, how Tibetan activists and Hong Kong activists were detained, and a lot of people now also speaking up against this genocide game. And this is a kind of also opportunities for the world, for the citizens to act and call it genocide game and raise awareness. I know things cannot change overnight, but gradually, slowly, it will, if we really believe our own power.
I understand that you have to remain optimistic, Rahima. Do you compare the campaign for awareness of what's happening to the Uyghur people to that of the 1990s, for instance, with the Tibetans? There was a stage where we could very easily have said that the Tibetan cause was probably equal in its global awareness to the Palestinian issue, and yet the cruelty towards Tibetan people, the destruction of the environment, the countryside, the economic migration to what was Tibet, including now other Chinese provinces, it doesn't really seem to have over the long term made very much difference. Indeed, neighbouring countries like Nepal tightened up their own policies against Tibetan immigration. Do you see a comparison?
Yes, definitely. What Tibetans experiencing since the occupation is almost exactly same as the Uyghurs. And you also know that the world didn't know about our struggle until the UN in 2018, the subgroup said there are up to 1 million Uyghurs detained, and then they started realize. And there are these people called Uyghur Muslims in China. Tibetan course, yes, sadly, still the struggle is ongoing. Situation is getting worse, just like what is happening to Uyghur people. Under this regime, unless the people and the world to act, especially the reason that Xi Jinping and the CCP is acting so blatantly and persecuting, like Dr. Azim Ibrahim said, not only just the Muslims, the Tibetans, the Mongolians, own citizens as well, because of that money power. And in order to change this, diplomatic countries, and especially those countries who believe in human rights and much higher value human rights and humanity above money, we need this kind of allies to tackle this. You cannot achieve this with one country or two. This has to be a collaborated effort, coordinated effort to really counter China. For example, IPAC, Interparliamentarian Alliance on China. Now there are 20 countries are trying to also find a way. Is there any way that we can defend and collaborating in a way to defend Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and the people of China who are really struggling, are persecuted under the CCP regime, and therefore I know road is bumpy, is going to be very long time. Because under the CCP, I don't know if you read the Daily Mail, that the interview about this Chinese policeman who gave very detailed information about what is happening to the Uyghurs, and this kind of, for me, it gives hope. There are people, the Chinese police and Chinese people also coming forward, exposing the CCP. And so that is what I meant, hope, because there are people are waking up, and that slowly, but change will come. Maybe not immediately, but it will in the end. That's how I believe in this fight.
Thanks, Rahima. Let's hope that it doesn't come too late. Janet Barth has asked, if there are so many issues, why does China still have so much power? Perhaps this can be directed to you, Azim. It's not just about politics. It's about economics. It's about a population of 1.3 billion. It's about projected power. It's also, I would imagine, about a little bit of faffing about by the West. We've just seen a pivot on the failure in Afghanistan from, I would say, the West to the East. What's your view on that? Why is China retaining so much power?
Well, China retains its power. Most of its power comes from its economic ability. It's essentially become the workshop of the world. It has become the manufacturing hub of the world. And many countries are relying on China for their own economies. In Europe, for example, for the post-COVID economic recovery, Angela Merkel was looking to China for its recovery. You know, they export billions of dollars worth of cars to China every year, and cars are obviously one of the major exports of Germany. And this is something that she was not willing to jeopardize. Now, this is the biggest and most influential economy in Europe, and hence they have a big influence on setting European Union policy, and hence why she was pushing through the EU-China trade deal when other countries, including the United States, were very staunchly against this. So China's power comes from its economics, and we have to remember that the number one thing that the Communist Party fears in China is not that there will be an invasion from the United States or Taiwan may declare independence or something of that nature. The number one thing that they fear is that the economy will slow down and unemployment will rise. They cannot create the same number of jobs, and then people will start asking questions on the legitimacy of the Communist Party and the corruption, which is very endemic at the highest levels of the Communist Party. So their priority is to keep the economy going and to keep the whole machinery functioning, which is why they have put so much effort into the long game. And I should just point out very quickly, Lynn, is that what China is doing in Xinjiang, people in the West may not even know where that is. They may not care much to think it's a far-off place happening to a far-off people. But what is happening in Xinjiang will have serious repercussions throughout the globe. What China is doing is that it's testing out some of the most sophisticated surveillance equipment in the world. China knows it has to keep a tab on its people, and what they're doing in Xinjiang is essentially testing how to control a very, very large population using all the most high-tech devices that they could possibly create, from facial recognition, machine learning, identifying people where they are. And they are now expanding this to the rest of the population. So it's not just the Uyghurs that are at the brunt of this. And now they are interested in exporting this to other countries around the globe. And this is a dictator's dream come true, is how do you control a very large population using the most sophisticated technology when you don't have the legitimacy and the manpower to do so? So countries like Venezuela, countries like the Philippines and others have already expressed intense interest in this kind of technology. So you may not care much about Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, but make no mistake, all of this will be coming to your doorstep quite soon.
Have you not noticed, though, that there may be some sort of beginning of a backlash? For instance, the UK deciding to remove Huawei surveillance equipment from the tube, for instance. There does seem to be, in democratic countries, amongst populations that can vote for their leadership, a feeling that there is a point where there is too much surveillance, and Huawei really became the name associated with the surveillance state. And then, as you say, we saw the kidnap diplomacy, if you like, in retaliation for the arrest of the Huawei executive who was travelling on a diplomatic passport in Canada. So is there some sort of beginnings of a backlash, do you think, against this need for overarching surveillance and control by the Chinese state, which has become an export product?
Yeah, I think there is. We are beginning to see some of this. The UK is only one of the countries to reject Huawei. We have Australia and there's Canada and there's obviously the United States, but much more has to be done. One of the policies of Huawei is to dominate the 5G and to dominate the next generation of telecommunications. And once they are completely embedded within the infrastructure of your country, then they have immense leverage over you. And this is exactly why Huawei got to the stage it did. The Chinese Communist Party subsidized Huawei by over 70 to 80 billion dollars to make sure that it becomes a preeminent 5G provider throughout the globe. And this is the case certainly in Africa and many other countries around the globe. But many countries are waking up to that. We've seen in the Czech Republic, in the UK and elsewhere, but much more needs to be done. And I think countries need to really start working together to find alternative 5G and other technological means to bring the latest technology to their own people. The failure to do so will have catastrophic consequences. China is investing very heavily in AI and machine learning. In fact, there are twice as many supercomputers now as the United States. And the advent of AI has been described by Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, as almost like the discovery of fire. AI will be integrated into the entire global economy, from everything that we can think of, from health, transport, infrastructure, everything. And whomsoever controls that will be setting the rules. So if you want to be part of this system, you'll have to abide by Beijing's rules. The next generation of companies, economic companies, the big tech companies will be coming out of China if they manage to dominate this field. So think about the Facebooks, the Ciscos, the IBMs, Microsoft. They'll all be coming out of China. And if you want to be part of that system, you have to abide by Beijing's rules. So they have a very clear strategy in terms of how they intend to dominate the globe and the international system. And we all, the democratic world, really has to wake up and start pushing back.
Thanks, Azim. One more question I think we have time for, and I'll ask you, Maria. We have seen some terrorism backlash in Pakistan against Chinese targets. Do you see this continuing? Is it a mushrooming movement against China's presence in Pakistan?
Thank you for the question. Yes, it is likely to continue. Given that Pakistan does have also some restive issues within its own territory, in Balochistan, for instance, depending on the perspective, you may say Pakistan occupies or does not occupy Balochistan. It is a matter of perspective, but definitely Pakistan does have a colonial attitude in Balochistan. That comes in the package of how Pakistan uses the port of Gwadar, and for instance treats the population of Gwadar at the expense of developing a port that thus far does not have any significant economic activity. Definitely there are also political interests from Baloch groups, which are in terms of ethno-nationalistic motivations, with some key important economic exploitation backgrounds. So therefore that can be used as a terrorist form, a cause to cause some terrorist events. And yes, obviously the military will be fully committed to try to protect Chinese interests, but there are chances that we will keep seeing terrorist attacks happening in Pakistan against Chinese targets.
Indeed. Thanks, Maria. We have time for one more question. I'm going to direct it to you, Rahima. There does seem to be mutterings about a liberal voice within China itself raising its head, and perhaps the defection of the policeman who talked to CNN and the Daily Mail that you mentioned before about his activities in the detention and torture of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Is it a strong voice? Does it have the potential to rise up against government practices within China itself, or it's really too early and the state is too strong?
It is a bit too early, I would say, but things will gradually change because, of course, I don't have a lot of time to explain. There are a lot of problems that within China. Dr. Azim already touched base on all these problems. Eventually, the people of China also demand freedom. You know, when you reach to a certain level, when your lifestyle and living standard improved, and there will be more and more people demand change. And also the corruption, the level of corruption is so bad. So the things will change, but we cannot say that we might see very quickly. Just like 1989, I was at the Tiananmen Square. I left on the 2nd of June. We had hope that things will change, but sadly, it became worsened after that protest. But it also led this kind of democratic movement in China as well. And therefore, I do believe things will change, but sadly, I'm just repeating myself again. We just have to be patient. The awareness raising among young people, especially Chinese, are very, very important. We need to look into future, hopefully, that things will change eventually.
Thanks, Rahima. Thanks so much for your comments. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Thank you to all the viewers who are asking us questions. I'm afraid we've run out of time to come to you all. But let me say thank you to Rahima Mahmood, Maria Bastos, Azim Ibrahim, and of course to you, our viewers. That's it for today. Thank you and goodbye.